HaMelech Yoshev Al Kisei Ram V'Nisa Shochen Ad Marom V'Kadosh Shemo V'chatu ranenu tzadikim baronai la yesharim navatila Befi yesharim titromam udivrei tzadikim titbarach uvulshon chasidim tikadash Uvekerev Kiddoshim Tithala Umachalot Rivavot Amcha Beit Yisrael. Page 69. Leodot Le'alel L'Shapeach L'Fa'er L'Romem L'Hader L'Varech Le'alel Kales Al Kol Divrei Shira B'Tish Bachot David Ben Yishai Avdecha Mishichacha Yishtabach Shimcha Le'ad Malkeinu. Brachot Forod Me'ata V'Ad Olam Baruch Atah Adonai El Melech Gadol B'Tishbachot El HaHodaot Adon HaNiflaot Habocher B'Shirei Zimra Melech Elchei HaOlamim. Middle of page 70. Yigadal ve'yigadash Shemei Rabbah Bi'alma divra kirute Vayimlich machute b'chayechon Uvyomechon Uvechaye decho Beit Yisrael Bagala Bizman Kari Vimru Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mivorach Leolam Olmei Almaya Yitbarach ve'yishtabach Yitbar v'yitramam ve'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Dekudesha Brechu Le'ela le'ela Mikol birchata Ve'shirata tushbechata Ve'nechemata damiran V'alma v'imru amen. 71. Please rise. Barechu et Adonai hamevorach Baruch Adonai hamvorach Leolam Va'ed Baruch Adonai hamvorach Leolam Va'ed Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech haolam Yotzer or uvorei choshech oseh shalom uvorei et hakol or olam beotzar chayim orod me'ofel amar v'yehi. May be seated. Page 75. Two lines from the bottom. Or chadash al Tzion ta'ir v'nizkech ulana mehera le'oro Baruch atah Adonai yotzer ha'me'orot.
Amen.
76. Ahava ravav tanu Adonai Eloheinu Chem lagdola v'tera Chamalta leinu Avinu Malkeinu בעבור אבותינו שבטחו בך, אבינו מלכנו. בתלמדם חוקי חיים, כן תחננו תלמדנו, אבינו האב הרחמן, המרחם רחם עלינו. ותן בליבנו להבין ולהשכיל לשמוע, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות. ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה, והאר עינינו בתורתך, ודבק ליבנו במצוותיך. ויחד לבבינו לאהבה וליראה את שמך, ולא נבוש לעולם ועד, ולא נבוש לעולם ועד, כי בשם קדשך הגדול והנורא פתחנו, נגילה ונשמחה בישועתך. ויביאנו לשלום מארבע כנפות הארץ, ותוליכנו קומיות לארצנו, כי אל פה ישועות אתה, ובנו בחרת מכל עם ולשון, וקרבתנו לשמך הגדול סלע באמת, להודות לך ליחדך באהבה, ברוך אתה אדוני, הבוחר בעמו ישראל באהבה. Page 77, Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, bechol levavcha ubechol nafshecha ubechol meotecha, ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha, ve'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam, ve'shivtecha v'veitecha u'v'lachtecha v'aderech u'shachbecha u'kumecha u'kshartam liot al yadecha ve'ayu l'totafot b'neinecha u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha. Adonai Elohechem emet. Page 80. Tehilot le'el elyon baruch u'mvorach Moshe u'Miriam u'vnei Yisrael lechanu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh norati lot osef eleh shira chadasha shibchu gilim l'shimcha al sfat hayam yachad kulam hodu v'yimlichu v'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed Sur Yisrael, Kuma be'azrat Yisrael, Uftechinu mecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go aleinu Adonai tzvaot shemo, Kedosh Yisrael, Baruch atah Adonai gal Yisrael. Please rise. We'll start the Amidah together on page 81. Adonai sifatai tiftachu fi yagi tehilatecha Baruch atah Adonai ay 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 Eloheinu ay 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 Elohei Avotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov ay 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 Elohei Sarah ay 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 Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor V'Hanora ay 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 El Elyon ay 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 Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Konei Hakol V'Zocher Chasdei Avot U'Mimahot ay 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 U'Mevigo Alifnei B'neihem ay 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 Leman Shmo B'Yahava Misod Chachamim U'Nevonim U'Milamedan Mevinim Evtecha Fi B'Tfila V'Tachanunim Lechalod Ulchanein Pnei Melech Malchei Hamlachim V'Adonei Adonim Zachrenu l'chaim, melech hafetz b'chaim, v'chadfenu b'sefer chaim, lemancha Elohim chaim. Melech ozer ufoked Moshe u'magen, Baruch atah Adonai, magen Abraham ufoked Sarah.
Amen.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיה מתים אתה רב להושיע, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיה מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופך עולים ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר, מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומדום מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה מצמיח ישועה. מי כמוך ברחמים, זוכר צורה בחיים ברחמים. ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני, חיי המתים.
Amen.
ברוך אדוני לעולם אלוהיך ציון לדור ודור, הללויה. ואתה קדוש יושב תהילות ישראל, אל נא. Continue silently. Page 92, Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu chatanu lefanecha. Avinu Malkeinu ein lanu melech eleata. Avinu Malkeinu hachazirenu b'tshuva shlema lefanecha. Avinu Malkeinu shlach refuah shlema lecholei amecha. Avinu Malkeinu zachrenu b'zikaron tov lefanecha. Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer chayim tovim. Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer gula v'shua. Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer parnasa v'chalkala. Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer zechuyot. Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer slicha umchila. Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu aseh leman ba'e va'esh uvamayim al kiddush shemacha. Avinu Malkeinu aseh lemancha im lo lema'anenu. Avinu Malkeinu chanenu v'anenu. Avinu Malkeinu chanenu v'anenu ki ein banu masim. Aseh imanu tzedaka v'chesed. Aseh imanu tzedaka v'chesed v'hoshienu. Page 94, Kaddish Shalem. Yikara v'yikara shemei Rabbi.
Amen.
V'yamad yivrak kirutei v'yamlech malchutei b'chayachon v'yomechon v'chayin kol beit Yisrael b'agalav yizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbi mevorach le'olam le'amaya yitbarach. Yitbarach v'yishabach v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalal shmei kudusha brichu. Leila, Leila, min kol berchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechamata, damiran b'yama v'imru. Amen. Take up outside home Babuhon, Dechal Yisrael, Kadam Abuhon Divishmaya Vimru. Amen. Yeheshlam Baruch Shemaya V'chaim, Alenu V'Alkol Yisrael Vimru. Amen. O Seh Shalom B'Mramav, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Alenu V'Alkol Yisrael V'imeru. Amen.
Shana Tova, Boker Tov. In introduction to today's Torah portion, I'd like to read something written by Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, about his experience learning about the story of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac for the first time. If you want to read along with me, you can find it on page 104 of your Machzor on the left-hand side at the bottom. Here is the experience of a child of 7 who was reading in school the chapter which tells of the sacrifice of Isaac on the way to Mount Moriah with his father. He lay on the altar, bound, waiting to be sacrificed. My heart began to beat even faster. It actually sobbed with pity for Isaac. Behold, Abraham now lifted the knife, And now my heart froze within me with fright. Suddenly the voice of the angel was heard. Abraham, lay not your hand upon the lad, for now I know that you fear God. And here I broke out in tears and wept aloud. Why are you crying? Asked the rabbi. You know that Isaac was not killed. And I said to him, still weeping, but Rabbi, supposing the angel had come a second too late. The rabbi comforted me and calmed me by telling me that an angel cannot come late. An angel cannot be late, but man made of flesh and blood may be. On Rosh Hashanah, we're very much in touch with the fragility of life and the importance of all of our actions. My prayer for the coming year for us is that we may not come too late in the opportunities we have to save the lives around us. Jeanne will now read a few psukim from our Torah portion.
If you want to follow along, I'm on page 105. I'm starting with the fourth aliyah, the fourth verse. Vayikra malach Adonai el Avraham shenit min hashamayim vayomer bihi nishbati le'um Adonai ki יען אשר עשית את הדבר הזה, ולא חסכת את בנך את יחידך. כי ברך ברך, והרבה הרבה זרעך כוכבי השמיים, וכחול אשר על שפת הים, וירש זרעך את שער אויביו. והתברכו בזרעך כל גויי הארץ, עקב אשר שמעת בקולי. וישב אברהם אל ערב, ויקומו, וילכו יחדיו אל באר שבע, וישב אברהם בבאר שבע. And continuing with the fifth verse. ויהי אחרי הדברים האלה, ויוגד לאברהם לאמור, הנה ילדה מילכה גם היא, בנים לנחור אחיך. את עוז בכורו ואת בוז אחיו, ואת כמואל אבי ארם. ואת כסר ואת חזו, ואת פילדש ואת ידלה, ואת בתואל. ובתואל ילד את רבקה, ושם שמונה אלה ילדה מילכה לנחור אחי אברהם. ופילגשו ושמה ראומה, ותלד גם היא את טבע ואת גחם ואת תחש ואת מאחה.
Chag Sameach. Today, in Genesis 22, the story of the binding of Isaac, sometimes referred to by its Hebrew, the Akedat Yitzchak, we read, "Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he answered, Hineni, here I am. Why is Abraham called twice? And whose voice does the calling hear? On the morning of May 26th, while the world was shut down for COVID and my children slept in instead of rising for their school day, I awoke early to enjoy my morning coffee in peace. I sat in my armchair, as I do every morning, and opened the daily news, browsing for whatever would stir me. And there I happened upon a video just posted by a 17-year-old girl. Like Darnella Frazier, the teenager who filmed the arrest, I had no idea I was about to witness the murder of George Floyd. He was lying face down, his hands bound behind his back, his feet restrained, forced into submission with a knee on his neck. And while I could hear George's pleas for mercy, it was the cries from the peaceful protesters who stood with Darnella, also pleading for mercy, that dominate the soundscape in this particular video recording. Darnella and the bystanders could hear the voice of his cry on this day and answered in his time of trouble. Yet none of the 4 arresting officers heeded their pleas. Last week, on the day I would receive the request to deliver this Devar Torah, I had woken for the day in the same way. This time, as my son was up in his room, learning virtually, I found myself sitting on my kitchen floor, glued to the 20-minute body cam video of Officer Tao, who later in his testimony describes his role in the murder of George Floyd as, quote, a human traffic cone, keeping the peaceful protesters at bay so that his fellow officers could carry out their duty. This footage focuses only on the protesters, these upstanders on the sidewalk pleading for mercy, demanding that the officers check his pulse, that they take their knee off of George's neck, like the famous plea from the Honorable Justice of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may her memory be a blessing. Quote, all I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks. Yesterday, Rabbi Katz reminded us that Rosh Hashanah is a time for teshuvah, a time for looking back and reflecting, a turning which allows us to alter course. And Erwin directed our attention to the sidebar in the Machzor and read, quote, the new year is a time to recognize what is of ultimate value to us, what of the past we wish to recall and carry with us into the future, and what of the past we would like God to recall. It is a day to meditate on our behavior in the world. Though different in many aspects, the binding of Isaac shares in common with the tragedy of George Floyd the recurring motif of being bound, being held captive and powerless, and at the mercy of the perpetrator's ability to hear and to listen to a voice of reason, a higher calling, or to bystanders on a sidewalk. I may have been horrified and angry about George Floyd for a time, but by returning again to Amidah Yitzchak today, I'm beginning to see how one informs the other. If I am to do teshuvah and recall something from my past that I must carry, then I turn and face my own reflection, the place where these stories interact with my own. I can relate to finding myself bound and in mortal danger. When I was 5, 3 days after turning 5 to be exact, we lived on the 9th floor, across from the bank of elevators. Even by that age, I was accustomed to seeing people waiting outside of our apartment door for an elevator to arrive. So on the afternoon that I asked my mother for a Dixie cup of water, Dafka, in the moment, that we were heading out the door to fetch my sister from school, I thought nothing of the man standing outside of our open door. I stood in the doorway, waiting for my mom to come back from the kitchen, and he stood in the hallway, waiting for the elevator. Just a normal moment in time. But as my mother and I proceeded to walk out together, he was standing in front of us, gun cocked. We were ordered back into the apartment. We were made to lie prone on the floor, face down, and he bound our feet. I cried. He told my mother to shut me up. My mom was my human shield, and she bared down on top of me with all of her weight. My indelible memory was of crying and trying to breathe from under her. I remember feeling like I had no space to breathe. After the ordeal, I also recall sitting on the couch, my feet still bound, forgotten about by the adults, my mother and the police in the room with us. What angel of God stayed his hand? There were no bystanders to cry out in our time of trouble. The only voice to speak reason came from my mother, who found the wherewithal to speak calmly and rationally to him. She says they had something of a conversation. From her position on the floor, she said to him, "Tell me what you want, and I can tell you where it is." It was really something of a miracle that he heard her voice. Had he not been listening, who knows what he would have done next in these tense moments? Money, he answered her. He heard her. Heard her. We were shown mercy that day. Here I must quote from the Mishnah, from Tractate Ta'anit 2:4, where it is written, quote, "He who answered Jonah in the belly of the fish, he shall answer you and hear the voice of your cry on this day. Blessed are you, Lord, who answers in the time of trouble." From my perspective, I was in the belly, under my mother crying, and my mother found her voice, and we were spared a worse outcome. Our perpetrator absconded with a few $100s my parents kept stashed in the spice box above the stove, placed there like the ram caught in the thicket, and he was gone. Where is God's voice in the world, and how do we know when we hear it? Even Abraham had to be called twice before he realized he was being spoken to from heaven. So focused he was on his grisly duty, he almost missed the call. In his article, The Spirituality of Listening, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs points out that Western civilization was built along two parallel tracks. On one side of the Mediterranean Sea, there was Greece, with its ideals sculpted in art and architecture, and which remains today as the dominant paradigm in which we see the world and attain knowledge. But the Judaism that grew out of ancient Israel and our textual tradition is a religion of listening. Rabbi Sachs goes on to say that, quote, Judaism offered a radical alternative. In fact, one of the most important words and fundamental prayers in Judaism is Shema, calling us to hear, to listen. And so we cannot see God, but we can listen and we can hear. But how do you know it is God who is speaking if the speaker can't be seen? In the case of Abraham, he too almost misses the call to stay his hand and not sacrifice his son Isaac. Does the angel call Abraham's name twice because he wasn't paying attention? Or was he dismissive at first, having failed to grasp that it was indeed the voice of God speaking through an angel, an instrument of the divine? And if we are all made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, are we not all then an instrument of the divine whose voice comes through us? In the voices of the bystanders who were yelling out in opposition, "Take your knee off his neck, check his pulse," whereas Abraham came to hear the voice of God, Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. The officers in the case of George Floyd were not open to hearing the voice of God through whatever mouthpiece was being used and not seeing the divine in everybody, not just from the victim, but from those pleading from the side. Imagine if Abraham had failed to hear the voice of God from the angels in heaven. The Akedah is one of the most emotionally triggering stories in the Torah because we struggle to understand why a father would be willing to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loved, no matter who asks. The reader is asked to find meaning, which is often summed up as a cruel test by which to judge Abraham's trust in and loyalty to God. But this summation puts us at risk of being in deep conflict with God. Instead, I offer constructive action that will help us behave in the world according to that radical Jewish alternative. Hear. Be that voice of reason. Heed that voice of reason. Recognize when it calls and know that you won't necessarily realize who is doing the speaking. Be generous with your attention. This year, I wish you all the blessing of open ears. Thank you. Shana Tova umetuka.
We turn to page 115. We'll be reading Gimel in English. May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless all who engage in acts of healing and all who visit the sick. May the Holy One justly reward them and bless them with wisdom and understanding, strength and openness as they faithfully engage in their tasks. May all their works be blessed and successful, along with those of all people Israel. And let us say Amen. Goodness. So normally we would continue with the shofar service, but that's going to be held separately today at 2 and 3 o'clock for those who signed up. Page 123 for Chatzi Kaddish. Yitkadal ve'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah v'yamad yivrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon u'b'yomechon u'b'chayedecho Beit Yisrael b'agala u'b'zman kariv ve'yimeru Amen. Yehishne Rabba mevorach le'avot me'amaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalash
Brichu.
Le'ela, le'ela, mikol birchata sheshirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, ta'amiran ve'ama ve'imeru.
Amen.
The silent Amidah starts on page 125 and continues through page 139. Shalom bimroma, uyase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru, Amen. Page 140. Hineni ani amimas nireshet venivchedet mi pachad yoshev tilot Yisrael. באתי לעמוד ולהתחנן לפניך על עמך ישראל אשר שלחוני, אף על פי שעיניך לא יראו לך. לכן אבקש ממך, אלוהי אברהם, אלוהי יצחק, ואלוהי יעקב, אלוהי שרה, אלוהי רבקה, אלוהי רחל, אלוהי לאה. אדוני, אדוני, אל רחום בחנון אלוהי ישראל, שדי היום ונורא. היה נא מצליח דרכי אשר אני הולכת, לעמוד ולבקש רחמים עלי ועל שולחי. יהי רצון לפניך, אדוני אלוהי אברהם יצחק ויעקב, שרה רבקה רחל ולאה, האל הגדול והגיבור והנורא, אל עליון. אחיה אשר אחיה, שתבוא תפילתי לבני חסד כבודך, בעבור כל הצדיקים והחסידים, התמימים והשערירים, ובעבור כבוד שמך הגדול והנורא, כי אתה שומע תפילת עמך ישראל ברחמים. ברוך אתה שומע תפילה. The repetition of the Amidah begins on page 141. Baruch atah Adonai Elohim הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות, ומביא גואל לבני בניכם למען שמו באהבה. מסוד חכמים ונבונים, ומלמד דעת מבינים, הבטחה פי בתפילה בתחנונים, לחלות ולחנן, בני מלך מלכי המלכים, אדוני האדונים. זוכרנו לחיים, מלך חפץ בחיים, וכותבנו בספר החיים, למענך אלוהים חיים. Page 142. מלך עוזר ופוקד ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ופוקד שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע. מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לישני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומדומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה. מי כמוך אב הרחמים, זוכר יצוריו לחיים ורחמים, ונאמן אתה לך חיות מתים. ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים. Top of page 143. May our sanctification ascend to you, for you are our sovereign God. ונתן את תוקף קדושת היום, כי הוא נורא ואיום, ובו תנשא מלכותך, וייכון בחסד כיסאך, ותשב עליו באמת. אמת כי אתה הוא דיין ומוכיח, ויודע ועד, וחוטא וחותם, וסופר ומונה, ותזכור כל הנשכחות, ותיתח את ספר הזיכרונות, ומאליו יקרב, וחותם יד כל אדם בו. ובשופר גדול יתקע, וכל תממה דקה יישמע, ומלאכים יחפזון, וחילו הרדה יוחזון, ויאמרו הנה יום הדין, לפקוד הצבע מרום הדין, כי לא יזכו בניך בדין, כי לא יזכו בניך בדין, וכל בעולם יעברו לפניך כבני מרום. כבקרת רועה עדרו, מעביר צאנו, תחת שבטו, כן תעביר, מסתפור ותמנה,
Rosh Hashanah yikatevun, uyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Rosh Hashanah yikatevun, uyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Kama ya'avrun vechama yibareun, mi yichye umi yamut, mi vekitzot. Umi vekitzo, umi lo vekitzo, mi va'esh umi va'mayim. Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, uviyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, uviyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Mi v'charev umi v'chaya, mi v'ra'av umi v'tzama. Mi v'ra'ash u'mi v'magefa, mi v'chanika u'mi v'skila. Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, u'bayom tzom kippur yechatemun. Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, u'bayom tzom kippur yechatemun. Who will be at peace and who will be troubled? Who will be serene and who will be disturbed? Who will be tranquil and who will be tormented? Who will be impoverished and who will be enriched? Who will be brought low and who will be raised up? Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, uyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Berosh Hashanah yikatevun, uyom tzom kippur yechatemun. Uteshuva, utfilah, utdaka, ma'avirin et ra hagezera. Ki keshimcha kin tehillatcha, כאשר לכעוס ונועד לרצות, כי לא תחפוץ במות האמת, כי אם בשובו מדרכו בחייו. ועד יום מותו תחכה לו, אם ישוב מיד תקבלו. אמת כי אתה הוא יתרם, ואתה יודע יתרם, כי הם בשר ודם. האדם יסודו מעפר, וסופו לעפר. בנפשו יביא לחמו, משו כחרס אני אשבר, כחציר יבש וכציץ נובל, כצל עובר וחנן קלה, וכרוח נושבת, וכאבק פורח, וכחלום יאור. ואתה הוא מלך אל חי וקיים. Your years never end. Your time has no measure. The extent of your glory can never be imagined. For there's no understanding of the mystery of your nature. Your name befits you as you befit your name, and you have linked our name with yours.
עשה למען שמך וקדש את שמך מקדישי שמך בעבור כבוד שמך הנערץ והנקדש. 145. כסות יספי קודש המקדישים שמך בקודש דרהם עליים דרהם אתה ככתוב על יד נביאך וכרזה זה ואמר
קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלכות כבודו.
קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלך כל הארץ כבודו 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 מלא עולם משרתיו שואלים זה לזה איה מקום כבודו לעומתם ברוך יאמרו
ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו.
ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו 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 יפה מרחמים ויחדם המייחדים שמו ערב בבוקר בכל יום תמיד פעמיים באהבה שמה אומרים שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד הוא אלוהינו אבינו הוא מלכנו מושיענו והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנית לעיני כל חי להיות לכם אלוהים
אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
אני אדוני אלוהיכם אדיר אדירנו אדוני אדוננו אדיר שמך בכל הארץ והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד ודברי קודשך כתוב לאמור
מלך אדוני לעולם מלכי ציון לדור ודור הללויה.
ימלוך אדוני לעולם מלכי ציון לדור ודור הללויה. לדור ודור נגיד קולך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה. We turn to page 151. You alone, Adonai, will rule all our creation. From Mount Zion, the dwelling place of your glory, and from Jerusalem, your holy city. As it is written in the book of Psalms, Adonai will reign forever, your God, O Zion, from generation to generation. Yimloch Adonai le'olam, Elohai Tzion, ledor vador, hallelujah. You are holy and your name is revered, for there is no God but you. As your prophet Isaiah wrote, Adonai Tzvaot will be exalted through justice. The holy God sanctified through righteousness. Baruch atah Adonai,
Baruch Shema.
Melech HaGadol.
Amen.
אתה בחרתנו מכל העמים, אהבת אותנו ורצית בנו, ורוממתנו ככל הלשונות, וקידשתנו במצוותיך, וקרבתנו מלכנו לעבודתך, ושמך הגדול והקדוש עלינו קראת. ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה את יום הזיכרון הזה, יום תורה מקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים. Turning to page 153. And I know Erwin read this yesterday, but I think it bears repeating, especially when, as Rabbi Katz talked about in her sermon the other day, we're working on translating a service that we're accustomed to being in person to being away, and all the little changes that that entails. The special sections of Musaf, Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. The distinctive feature of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf Amidah is the insertion of Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, the verses relating to God's sovereignty, to remembrance, and to the sounding of the shofar, into the typical 7 bracha structure of the holy day Amidah. The verses of Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot highlight the complex, interrelated themes of Rosh Hashanah. The New Year is a time to recognize what is of ultimate value to us, what of the past we wish to recall and carry with us into the future, and what of the past we would like God to recall. It is a day to meditate on our behavior in the world. What are we called to? From a religious perspective, what goals are worth striving toward? In each of the 3 sections, a poetic introduction is followed by 10 biblical verses, 3 from the 5 books of Torah, 3 from Psalms, 3 from prophets, and then another verse from the Torah. Each verse contains the key word for that section, a reference to sovereignty, to memory, or the shofar. Additional poetic material introduces the last verse of each section. The section then concludes with the bracha, the blowing of the shofar, normally, but not today, and 2 brief prayers, one announcing this day is the birthday of the world, Hayom Harat Olam, and the second a plea that our prayers be heard, Areshet Tzafatenu. The recitation of biblical verses is mandated in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which provide guidelines for their selection. However, the number of verses required was a subject of debate. The predominant opinion is 10, as Warren said yesterday, 3 from Malchuyot, 3 Zichronot, 3 Shofarot, while the minority, plus 1, the Torah at the end, while the minority holds that 3 is sufficient, 1 from each of the major biblical divisions. Ochila lahel, achalefanav, eshalam imeinu ma'ane lashon, asher bikalam ashira uzo, abiyare naot be'ad nifalav, le'adam Marachilev u'me'adonai ma'ane lashon. Adonai sfatai tiftach u'fi agid tehilatecha. Yihyu leratzonim refi. Yihyu leratzonim refi. Ve'hegion libi lefanecha. Ve'hegion libi lefanecha. Adonai tzori ve'goali. Adonai tzori ve'goali. Aleinu leshabeach l'Adon hakol latet gedula liyotzeh bereshit shelo asanu kegoyei haratzot ve'lo samanu kemishpechat adama shelo sam chelkenu kahem ve'goralenu kechol hamonam v'anachnu korim עושה הארץ ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל ושכינתו זו בגובה מרומים ואלוהינו אינו לבן מלכינו אפס זולתו ככתוב בתורתך וידעת היום והשבות על לבבך כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ מתחתינו. We turn to page 156, starting in the middle page, and I'll be reading the Aleph verses. As it is written in your Torah, Adonai will be sovereign forever and ever. And it is also written in Psalms, for sovereignty is Adonai's. God rules over the nations. And your servants, the prophets, further wrote, thus said Adonai, sovereign and redeemer of Israel. Adonai Tzebaot, I am the first and I am the last. There is no God but me. 4 lines from the bottom of the page in Hebrew. V'taheh libeinu, v'taheh libeinu, v'taheh libeinu le'avdecha be'emet, v'taheh libeinu, v'taheh libeinu, v'taheh libeinu le'avdecha be'emet, ki ata Elohim emet, u'devarcha emet v'kayam le'ad, baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch Shema.
Melech al kol haaretz, v'kadesh Yisrael. Melech al kol haaretz, v'kadesh Yisrael. V'yom hazikaron.
Amen.
On page 161. Again with the Aleph verses. As it is written in your Torah, God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to blow across the earth, and the water subsided. And it is also written in the book of Psalms, God has made wondrous works to be remembered. Adonai is gracious and compassionate. And your servants, the prophets, further wrote, go proclaim to Jerusalem. Thus said Adonai, I remember the affection of your youth, your love when we were betrothed, when you followed me in the wilderness, a barren land. 162, near the top of the page. For their sake, I will remember the covenant with that first generation, with whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of nations to be their God. I am Adonai. You have always remembered that which has been forgotten, for there is no forgetting in your realm. So on this day, in your great mercy, remember the binding of Isaac for the sake of his descendants. Baruch atah Adonai, zocher habrit.
Amen.
Page 164. As it is written in your Torah, on the 3rd day as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning, a dense cloud covering the mountain, and the powerful sound of the shofar. All the people who were in the camp trembled. And it is also written in Psalms, God ascends amidst the cry of the shofar. With its sound, Adonai is enthroned. Kol hanshama hallelujah, hallelujah. Kol hanshama hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah el bekodsho, hallelujah berkia uzo, hallelujah begvoratav, hallelujah rov kudlo. Kol hanshama hallelujah, Hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Beteka shapar. Hallelujah. Beneva vechino. Hallelujah. Betofu macho. Hallelujah. Benim beuga. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Betzilzele shama. Hallelujah. Betzilzele trua. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel. Hallelujah. And your servants, the prophets, further wrote, all you inhabitants of the world and dwellers on earth, when a banner is raised on the mountains, look. When the shofar is sounded, listen. As it is written in your Torah, on your joyous occasions, your fixed festivals and new moons, you shall sound the trumpets over your sacrifices and offerings. They shall be a remembrance of you before your God. I, Adonai, am your God. Hayom harat olam, hayom ya'amid b'mishpat, ko yitzurei olamim, im kvanim, im kevanim rachamenu, kerachem aval banim, ve'im ka'avadim, hinenu lecha teluyot, ad shetechonenu, v'totzicha or mishpateinu. Hayom kadosh. Arashet tzipatinu yererav lefanecha eram venisa. Arashet tzipatinu yerav lefanecha eram venisa. Mevinu ma'azin ma'abitu ma'akshib lekol tekiyateinu utgaper berachamim uveratzon seder shofroteinu. Page 169. Eloheinu Elohei Avoteinu, Baruchenu v'beracha, המשולשת בתורה, הכתובה על ידי משה עבדך, האמורה מפי אהרון יניו, כהנים עם קודשך כאמור. יברכך אדוני וישמרך, יאר אדוני פניו אליך ויקונך, יישא אדוני פניו אליך וישם לך שלום. שים שלום בעולם, טובה וברכה, חן וחסד ברחמים, עלינו ועל כל ישראל, עמך, ברכנו אבינו, כולנו כאחד, כולנו כאחד, באור פניך, כי באור פניך נתת לנו, אדוני אלוהינו. תורת חיים ואהבת חסד, וצדקה וברכה ורחמים, וחיים ושלום, וטוב בעיניך, לברך את עמך ישראל, בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך, בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. בספר חיים ברכה ושלום ופרנסה טובה, נזכר ונקדש לפניך. אנחנו וכל עמך בית ישראל, לחיים טובים, לחיים טובים ולשלום. ונאמר, through me shall your days be increased, and years be added to your life. Inscribe us for a good life, you who are the God of life. Write us in the book of life, as it is written in your Torah. And those of you who cling to God on this day are truly alive today. Hayom, Shalem is page 171. Yit Gadal V'Yikadash Shemei Rabba.
Amen.
Ve'amad Yivrak Yirutei V'yamlich Malchotei B'chayei Chonu V'yamei B'chayei D'chol Beit Yisrael Ba'agala U'Vizman Kari Ve'yimeru. Amen. Yehishmei Rabba Mevorach. Le'alam Olam Me'amaya Yitbarach. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitaleh Shemei D'Kudusha.
Rechu.
Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechemata damiran b'yama v'yimeru.
Amen.
Titkabel tzachon v'otzachon v'chol Yisrael kol lama v'chon v'yishmaya v'yimeru.
Amen.
Yehish lama rabba min shemaya v'chayim alinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yimeru.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'mromav v'yaseh shalom alinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yakol yoshvei tevel v'yimeru.
Amen.
Page 173 for Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabech Adon hakol, latet gedula liyotzeh breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei haratzot, velo samanu kemishpechot adama, shelo sam chelkinu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא שהוא נער שמיים וישראל. ככתוב בתורתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר בחיי אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יחיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Mourner's Kaddish on page 174. Yit Gadal v'Yit Kadash Shemei Rabba.
Amen.
Ve'amad Divarach Yirutei v'yamlich Malchutei. V'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael. V'agala u'v'zman Kariv v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehesh
Mei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam U'Me'almaya.
Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei D'Kudisha Brichu.
Brichu.
Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechamata, damiran b'yama v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehesh lama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'romav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imru amen.
Amen.
We turn to page 44 for a psalm for the season. Psalm of David. Adonai is my light and my help. Whom shall I fear? Adonai is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evil people assail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my enemies, and those who besiege me who stumble and fall. Should an armed camp be arrayed against me, my heart would show no fear. Should they war against me, of this I would be sure. One thing I ask of Adonai, this I seek, to dwell in the house of God all the days of my life, to behold God's beauty and visit in God's sanctuary. Were God to hide me in God's sukkah on the calamitous day, were God to enfold me in the secret recesses of God's tent, I would be raised up in a protecting fort. Now, I raise my head above the enemies that surround me and come with offerings amidst trumpet blasts to God's tent, chanting and singing praise to Adonai. Adonai, hear my voice as I cry out. Be gracious to me and answer me. It is you of whom my heart said, seek my face. It is your presence that I seek, Adonai. Do not hide your face from me. Do not act angrily toward me. You've always been my help. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me, my God, my deliverer. Though my father and mother abandon me, Adonai will gather me in. Show me your way, Adonai, and lead me on a straight path, despite those arrayed against me. Do not hand me over to the grasp of those who besiege me, for false witnesses and those who seek ill have risen against me. If only I could trust that I would see God's goodness in the land of the living. Place your hope in Adonai. Be strong, take courage, and place your hope in Adonai. Mourner's Kaddish can be found on page 174. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayedecho Beit Yisrael. B'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam olam me'almaya.
Maya.
Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yithaleh v'yitalal shmei d'kudesha b'richu.
Brichu.
Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush b'chata v'nechemata da'amiran v'yama v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama Rabba mitshemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'momav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imru amen.
Amen.
And 175 for Adon Olam. I don't remember what tune I wanted to do, so I guess I'll go traditional. Adon Olam asher malach, beterem kol yitzir nivra, le'ed nasa b'chefso kol, azai melech shemo nikra, ve'achare kichlot hakol, levado yimloch nora, vehu haya vehu hove, vehu yihye betifara, vehu echad ve'en sheni, lecham shilo lehachbira, veli reshit veli tachlit, velo ha'oz ve'hamizra, vehu eli v'chai goali, ve'tzur chevli be'et tzara, vehu nisi umanos li, menat kosi ve'yom ekra, ve'ado avkid ruchi, ve'et ishan ve'a'ira, ve'im ruchi gebiyati, Adonai li ve'lo yira. And L'Shana Tova Tikatevu, and he's will sing that one too. L'Shana Tova Tikatevu, L'Shana Tova Tikatevu, L'Shana Tova Tikatevu v'techatemu. May be you inscribed and sealed for a good year. Chag Sameach. Shana Tova.